The dust rose like old memories over the town square, a slow and silent dance of sunlight and soil. It was the kind of place time forgot, where the wood of buildings had dried into gray bones, and the air carried a hush thick with the wear of too many broken men and too few chances. The auctioneer's voice sliced through the stillness like a whip, sharp, tired, rehearsed. Men leaned on posts, chewed tobacco, spat dreams into the dirt. And among the livestock, the rusted tools, and the slow-turning wheel of a busted cart, stood a girl who did not belong. She wasn't pretty in the way townsfolk liked. No lace, no blush, no meekness to her eyes. Her dress was too short and too torn, the hem stitched by untrained hands. Her feet were bare, though it was near freezing, and her long black hair hung wild as rainless thunderclouds. There was a look about her, not of defiance, but of distance, as though her soul had wandered off long ago and left her body behind to finish whatever punishment life still had in store. No one knew quite where she'd come from anymore. Some whispered Comanche blood, others said she'd been born in a jail cell to a thief and a midwife. Truth never mattered much in places like this, not when rumors wore better boots. What folks did remember was that she'd been passed from hand to hand since she was small, never adopted, only taken. A settler family once tried to raise her like a proper girl, but she'd gone missing every other night, returning with sticks in her hair and a wild rabbit in her arms. A preacher tried to cleanse her with scripture until she laughed, soft, gentle, haunting, and he'd sworn she was the devil wearing a child's face. Now she stood here, 16, maybe 17, still unclaimed. The sheriff, tired of jailing her for trespassing on fields she didn't own, had decided she needed a man to tame her. But no one wanted a girl who couldn't be trained, who rode horses without saddles and once bit a rancher hard enough to draw blood. The auctioneer lifted his hat and scratched his balding head. "Too wild for any decent man," he muttered to the crowd. "But strong. Works like an ox. Eats near nothing. You get her, and you won't need a dog to watch your cattle." No one moved. A few chuckled. One man called out, "Does she come with a cage?" The girl didn't flinch. Her gaze wandered past the buildings, far beyond the crowd, to the hills in the distance. Her shoulders were square, but her eyes were tired. Not scared, just exhausted by the same old song. Another man stepped forward, half drunk, smelling of fire oil and stale bread. "I'll take her for kindling," he barked. "Too much spirit for a wife, but I could beat that out of her." The girl turned then. Slowly. Her gaze met his with the weight of something ancient, something cold and calm and far too knowing. He stepped back without meaning to. And just then, with the quiet of dust settling, another man stepped into the square. He wasn't much to look at, tall, dust-covered, boots worn thin. His coat was brown but bleached by sun, his hat wide-brimmed and soft with use. He led a mule behind him and walked like the world owed him nothing and he was content to let it be. His name was Elias Ward, though few would have recalled it. He'd owned a patch of dry land south of town, where nothing grew without a fight. Folks knew his wife had died 2 winters back, fever, they said, and he'd stopped coming into town save for feed and salt. Grief had hollowed him, carved silence into his face. He didn't come for a girl. He came for a bridal. But when his eyes met hers across the square, the stillness took on a shape. Not romance. Not destiny. Just recognition. Like two creatures that knew what it was to live without kindness. He didn't say a word. Just looked at the auctioneer and raised 2 fingers. $2? The man said. "She ain't a dog, Ward." Elias glanced at the girl. "That's all I've got." The crowd jeered, expecting a bid to rise. None came. The auctioneer sighed. "Sold then. You'll have to take her now. We don't hold property." The girl didn't look surprised. She walked to Elias like someone walking into weather, head high, steps light. She paused beside him but didn't speak. He offered her the mule's reins. She didn't take them. Just followed, barefoot, into the dry distance. They passed a boy selling apples. Elias bought 2. Handed her one. She bit into it without thanks, without hesitation. They didn't speak all the way back to his land, where fences leaned like tired old men and a windmill turned too slow to matter. There was no house, just a long cabin with a low porch, a barn, and fields stitched with stubborn weeds. He showed her the barn. Pointed to a corner with a blanket. "You can stay there," he said. She nodded once. He turned away. That night, the sky peeled open with stars. Coyotes howled somewhere near, and the girl sat cross-legged in the hay, running her hands over the wood grain as though it were a map. In the cabin, Elias sat beside a fire he didn't feel. He looked at the second apple she hadn't finished and thought of his wife, how she used to braid her hair in the mornings and whistle songs with no melody. Outside, the girl whispered to herself in a tongue he didn't know. Maybe it was prayer. Maybe wind talk. By dawn, she'd repaired the gate hinge with leather strips torn from her dress. He noticed but said nothing. For 3 days, they shared no more than a nod, a glance, the silence between footfalls. She worked as though the land belonged to her blood, her hands knowing when to stop digging, her eyes catching what his had missed. She fed the chickens, mended tools, slept in straw like a creature born of it. Elias brought her a coat one cold morning, placed it on the fence post. She didn't touch it for an hour. Then, when he wasn't looking, she put it on and buttoned it all the way up. A quiet truce was forming, not peace, not affection. Just space to breathe. On the 7th night, as frost silvered the world, she stood at the edge of the porch, eyes on the horizon. "Why'd you buy me?" she asked, voice like a leaf turning in the wind. Elias stood in the doorway. "Because no one else would." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. He cleared his throat. "You got a name?" She looked down at the coat, then up at the moon. "Used to," she said. "But it didn't stick." He almost smiled. "Well, let me know if it comes back." She turned and stepped down from the porch, walking slow toward the barn, each step gentle on the earth like she was afraid to wake something. Elias watched until she disappeared into shadow. Inside, the fire snapped once, then settled. And out across the field, a coyote sang. Not alone this time, but answered by a second voice. Higher, softer, wild. As if somewhere deep in the silence, two untamed things had found each other. Spring came slow that year, peeling back winter like old paint off barnwood, cracked, faded, but not yet lost. The land, hard and scarred from frost, softened in patches. Shoots of green dared to grow where only brittle thorns had stood. It was the kind of season that asked for patience. And patience, Elias had plenty of. What he hadn't expected was to find it reflected in the girl who now lived among his fields and silence. She still hadn't told him her name. Some days he thought to ask again, but her quiet way of moving through the world made him feel as if names were things too heavy for her to carry just yet. She answered to nothing, yet responded to everything, a nod, a glance, the softest whistle from across the yard. She slept in the barn, still, though he'd repaired the back room of the house for her. She never used it. Said nothing about it either. Just worked. From sunup to beyond sundown. She learned his ways without asking, fixed what needed fixing before he could even think to do it. One morning, he found her shoeing his old mule with a calmness born not of training but of knowing. Real knowing. Like the mule had told her exactly what it needed, and she'd listened. The townsfolk began to talk, as they always did. He heard it from the blacksmith first, then the grocer. That girl, they said, she's got you under some spell. Or maybe she's one of them shapeshifters. She tames wild horses but won't speak to a soul. You ever wonder what she's hiding? But Elias had stopped caring what folks thought long ago. The world had judged him just as cruelly after his wife passed. Said he was cursed, unlucky, maybe touched in the head. Now they simply turned their suspicions to the girl, because it was easier than admitting they'd thrown her away. He began to watch her in ways he hadn't meant to. Not desire, not yet. Just the kind of reverence. She moved like wind through wheat, always in rhythm with the land. He saw her coax a hawk from the fence post with her breath. Saw her sit for an hour beside a wounded fox until it died peacefully with its nose in her lap. He didn't know what kind of life she'd lived before, but it had carved something into her, something silent and wide like the prairie sky. Then one morning, he found her at the corral, trying to break in a young Mustang he'd never dared to ride. Wild thing, red with a black mane, eyes sharp as flint. Elias opened his mouth to stop her, but she didn't look his way. The girl had no rope, no whip. Just her hands open and steady. The Mustang bucked, reared, pawed the air. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward and laid her palm to its jaw. He watched, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe, as the horse lowered its head, twitching, wary, but willing. By the time the sun hit its peak, she was riding him bareback through the pasture like she was born from the same storm that birthed that horse. And Elias knew, then, what the sheriff had meant when he called her too wild. But he also knew that what others called wild, some men called free. And freedom was nothing to fear, only something to understand. That night, over boiled beans and cornbread, Elias cleared his throat. "You ever think of leavin'?" he asked, not sure why the words had found their way out. She sat across from him, coat still buttoned, hair still unbrushed, eyes fixed on the fire. "Don't belong nowhere," she said, "but I sleep easy here." He nodded. That was enough. Still, he noticed something different in her the following week. She moved slower. Ate less. The calluses on her hands were peeling, raw beneath. One morning, she didn't come out of the barn. Elias waited till noon, then knocked once on the beam outside her stall. She didn't answer. He stepped in. She was curled in the hay, face pale, eyes half shut but burning with fever. The kind of heat that stole weeks from a person in hours. Elias didn't waste time. He gathered her into his arms, lighter than she should have been, and carried her to the cabin. Laid her in the back room she'd never used. Sat beside her for 2 days and nights, changing cloths, boiling willow bark, murmuring words he hadn't spoken since his wife's last breath. She didn't speak. Just breathed. And every breath sounded like it might be the last. On the third morning, her eyes opened. "You smell like smoke," she whispered. Elias laughed, though it cracked through his throat. "That's what happens when you sit too close to the fire." Her lips twitched, barely. "Didn't think you'd come in." "I ain't the sheriff," he said. "I don't throw people out when they get hard to carry." That broke something in her, soft and slow. A tear found her cheek without permission. She closed her eyes again. But not to sleep. To rest. To trust. When she woke next, her fever had broken. She sat up, asked for water. Asked if the mule was fed. Asked how many days had passed. Elias answered every one. By dusk, she was on her feet again, stubborn as ever. Tried to return to the barn. "No," he said gently. "You stay here now. It's your room, same as it was hers. She'd have wanted it used." The girl looked around at the small, wooden space. The faded blue quilt. The shelf of old books gathering dust. She didn't argue. Just sat down on the bed and traced her fingers across the grain of the windowsill. That night, Elias left a bowl of soup outside her door. In the morning, the bowl was empty, and beside it sat a single feather, black, with a silver stripe. He understood it for what it was. A thank you and a promise. From that point on, something between them shifted. He found her humming now and then, soft and wordless. She let him braid her hair once, when her fingers were too blistered to manage. He watched her teach the chickens to come when she clucked twice. Saw her running with the Mustang at dawn, like they were one body split in two. And slowly Elias began to feel like maybe this land, which had once held only grief, was learning to breathe again. One evening, after a long day mending fence posts and gathering brush, Elias sat on the porch with a tin cup of water. She joined him, wrapped in a shawl she'd sewn from scraps. They watched the sun bleed orange across the hills. "You ever think we're just ghosts?" she asked quietly. "Looking for something that don't remember us?" Elias took a long sip, then set the cup down. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we're the ones who remember too much." The girl nodded. Then leaned her head against the post. For the first time since she arrived, she looked not just calm, but safe. And Elias, for the first time in years, didn't feel alone. In the distance, thunder rolled low, gentle, far off. But it was coming. And neither of them looked away. By the time the cottonwoods turned gold and crisp wind began to whisper through the valley, the ranch had become something more than a patch of land stitched together by barbed wire and sweat. It breathed now. It listened. And in quiet ways it began to heal. The girl, who still hadn't offered a name, had become part of its rhythm. Like rainfall, like firewood popping in the stove. She walked the fields with the Mustang trailing close, his nose brushing her shoulder like a brother keeping watch. There was still something untamed in her, something too big for fences. But she no longer flinched when Elias passed close. No longer paused at the door before stepping inside. She laughed, sometimes a small, hushed sound, like wind stirring a dry creek. Still, there were things she did not say. Shadows that danced behind her eyes when certain sounds echoed too sharply. Once, when a wagon passed near, drawn by voices from the mining town, rough, jeering men, she disappeared for the day. Elias found her deep in the woods that night, sitting beside an aspen tree with her arms wrapped around her knees, like she was trying to hold herself together before something broke loose. He didn't ask what had happened. Only offered her his coat and sat with her until the moon rose silver above them both. Whatever life she'd known before had taught her silence was safer than sorrow. Elias didn't ask for her wounds. He just gave her space enough to breathe. Then came the letter. It arrived in the hands of a rider Elias hadn't seen in years, a rangy man with a torn brim hat and a nervous stallion. He handed it over without words, tipped his head, and rode off. Elias turned the envelope over in his fingers, then opened it by the fire. It was from Silas Crowley, the rancher who'd sold the girl that day in town. The same man who'd called her too wild, too much. Said she spooked the stock and cursed the land. But the letter wasn't about regret. It was a warning. She's dangerous, it said. Stole from me. Disgraced my name. That girl ain't what she seems. And he ended with a line that made Elias go still. I'm coming to take back what's mine. Elias read the letter twice more, slowly, letting each word sit heavy in his gut. He folded it, slid it into the stove, and watched it burn to ash. The girl was brushing the Mustang when he found her. Her hands were steady, but her eyes caught the change in his face. What is it? She asked. He shook his head. Nothing needs fixing. She stared a moment longer, then returned to the horse's flank. That night, Elias bolted the doors for the first time in months. And the night after that, he sat on the porch with a shotgun across his lap. Silas Crowley didn't come that week. Nor the next. But something hung in the air now, thick and expectant. As if the land itself was bracing for a storm that hadn't quite arrived. Then, one dawn, as frost silvered the fence posts and the creek ran slower with ice, the girl came to Elias with her hat in her hands and her jaw set like stone. I should go, she said. He's looking for me. I know, Elias replied. He'll burn this place down to get what he wants. Let him try. She blinked, startled by the steel in his voice. He softened. You're not something to be claimed, girl. Not something to be chased or returned like borrowed goods. You want to go, you go. But not for him. She lowered her gaze. Her voice cracked on the edges. He wasn't always cruel. Just different. After my brother died, something in him turned. He drank more. Got mean. Said I reminded him of the boy. I tried to leave once, but he caught me. Said I owed him for keeping me alive. Elias's breath caught. He has no claim on you. Don't matter. Men like him, they think they own what they break. Elias nodded slowly. I've known that kind of man. She looked up at him then, the sun just beginning to light her face. Why'd you take me in? Because you were left out in the cold, he said. And I know what that feels like. Her eyes shimmered, but she held steady. I won't let him bring hurt to this place. You're not alone, Elias said. She stayed quiet, But he saw the war in her, fear clawing at courage, memory tangled in survival. That night, she didn't sleep in the house. Instead, she sat atop the barn with the Mustang tethered close, eyes watching the horizon. Just before dawn, a rider came. Silas Crowley. He looked older now, as if spite had fed off his bones. His coat hung loose over his shoulders, and a rifle rested on his saddle. 3 men followed behind, faces masked in indifference. Elias stepped out before they could reach the barn. "You're trespassing." Silas spat into the dirt. "I'm just here for what's mine." "She's not yours." "She was paid for." "She was abandoned." Silas smirked. "A man's allowed to change his mind." The girl's voice cut through the morning like a hawk's cry. "She's not yours anymore." They turned to see her standing on the roofline, hair caught in the breeze, eyes shining with something fierce and full. "You left me like garbage in the sun," she said. "Called me wild. Cursed. Unfit. I wore those words like shackles. But I don't wear them no more." Silas's jaw twitched. "You think you belong here? With him?" "I do belong. Not because someone said so. Because I stayed. Because I grew roots while you rotted." Elias stepped beside her then, a quiet force at her side. "You've got no welcome here," he said. "Turn back while you still can." Silas glanced to his men, but their hands remained at their sides. Something in the air told them this wasn't the fight they'd been promised. Silas sneered, but he backed away. "She'll ruin you too. Just wait." But Elias didn't answer. The riders turned, and the prairie swallowed them like fog. Only when their hoofbeats vanished did the girl step down. She leaned against the barn, shaking slightly. Elias didn't say a word. Just took her hand in his. Rough palm to rough palm. The morning passed slowly, tender as a bruise. Later, as the wind shifted and birds began to sing again, the girl looked up at Elias. "I'm tired of being no one." "Then be someone," he said, voice thick with something old and honest. "Right here." She nodded. "I was named Unia," she whispered. And just like that, the land seemed to sigh in relief. A name given. A truth reclaimed. Elias didn't speak. He simply looked at her as if the sun had finally risen after a long, bitter night. The days after Silas rode away were quieter, but not empty. Like a wildfire that had swept the edge of a forest and left the ground raw but fertile, something had changed in the soil of their days. There was no celebration, no sharp joy, but a quiet, aching relief. The kind that came from surviving, from standing when it would have been easier to run. Unia, she used her name now, though still cautiously, like testing the edge of a blade, began rising before the sun. Her steps had purpose, her hands knew the rhythm of work. She mended fences alongside Elias, and when calves were born, she knelt in the hay and whispered to them in soft tones, as if translating the world into something safe. She didn't talk much about Silas after that. But sometimes, when the wind howled too sharp, or the night settled with a strange hush, Elias would see her standing alone outside the barn, looking not back, but through, as if memory was something drifting just beyond the pines. One evening, as dusk melted across the fields, Unia sat with Elias on the porch. Her hands were cupped around a tin of coffee gone cold, and the fire inside the house glowed faintly behind them. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere long," she said softly, her voice like worn flannel. "Didn't think I was the kind of person folks kept around." Elias didn't look at her, only listened. "I learned early not to expect things to last. A warm bed. A kind word. Even just a place to rest my head where no one tried to take something from me." She drew a breath, the kind that carried weight. "But this place, it doesn't ask me to be smaller." Elias turned to her, his eyes gentle. "That's because you were never meant to be." Unia smiled barely. A silence settled between them. Not heavy, not hollow. Just full of things too sacred to name. Then the snow came. First in soft flurries that dusted the hilltops, then thicker, faster, until the entire land wore white like a baptism. The cattle grew restless. The fences groaned beneath ice. And the Mustang, still nameless but utterly loyal, stayed close to the barn and even closer to Unia. With winter came new routines. They cut wood daily, hauled water, worked in tandem without needing words. When the snow sealed them in for 3 days straight, Elias read aloud from a book he'd found tucked in the attic, a journal written by the ranch's first matron, a woman who'd crossed the plains with only a tin stove and a Bible. Unia listened by firelight, curled in the old rocking chair with a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes didn't flicker or drift. She soaked up the words like someone starving for stories that didn't end in sorrow. She wrote like she could see through time. Unia murmured one night, after Elias closed the book. Maybe she could, he replied. Unia tilted her head. You think people ever know when they're living through the part of life they'll remember most? Elias thought a moment. I think they know when they're not. That made her smile, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Outside, the wind wailed like a coyote mourning the moon. Spring promised to return, but not yet. The world had more silence to give first. And in that silence, something grew between them, not fast or wild like prairie fire, but steady like roots in thawing ground. Elias would sometimes find little things altered around the ranch. His old oil lamp, cleaned and mended. A new latch carved for the cellar. Bread baking in the stove, with a touch of rosemary he hadn't tasted in years. Unia never announced these things. She just did them. As if rebuilding the ranch also helped her rebuild something inside herself. One night, Elias found her sketching in the corner of the barn with charcoal and feed sack canvas. It was a rough image of the valley, broad and wide, with the outline of their cabin in the middle. You draw? He asked, surprised. Used to, she said, smudging the sky with her thumb. Stopped for a long while. Didn't think I deserved to create anything. Elias crouched beside her, watching as the image bloomed. You deserve all of it, he said. She blinked fast but didn't turn away. You talk like someone who's loved people before. I have, he said simply. But grief doesn't take the whole heart. Just the parts we give to silence. Unia didn't answer, but she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she touched him without need, just warmth for the sake of warmth. That same night, thunder rumbled across the sky. Not the dry crack of heat lightning, but the slow, guttural kind that spoke of coming change. Unia stood in the doorway as the rain came, heavy and thick. She smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, laughed with abandon, head tilted back, hair damp, hands flung wide like she was daring the sky to wash her clean. Elias watched from the porch, heart caught in his throat. She turned to him, soaked to the bone, but glowing. Storm's not here to hurt, she said. It's here to make room. And indeed, the storm didn't break the ranch. It nourished it. The creek swelled. The grass returned. And Unia began planting things. Small seeds. Herbs. Wildflowers she found in the woods. She painted the barn door in deep red and carved her initials, small and proud, into the frame. Elias built a second table for the cabin. Not because they needed it, but because the space deserved to feel fuller. One morning, Unia brought in a tiny foal, born too early, shivering and fragile. She wrapped it in her coat and placed it by the hearth. His name's Cypress, she said, stroking his head. Elias raised a brow. You giving names now? She smirked. I figure if I can carry mine, I can hand one out. Cypress survived. So did they. And soon, the ranch didn't feel like a place someone had stumbled into. It felt like a home two people had chosen to build. Still, even with all that peace taking root, the world hadn't forgotten them. Late one afternoon, a letter arrived. No writer. Just left on the fence post in a leather satchel, sealed with wax. Unia opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't from Silas. It was from someone else entirely, a lawyer from Cheyenne, bearing news that made Elias sit down hard on the porch steps. Silas Crowley was dead. Shot in a card-house brawl. Left behind no kin, no wife, no legacy. except for one deed. A parcel of land, nearly 60 acres, had been signed over, scrawled in near legible script, in the last week of his life. To Unia. There was no explanation. Just her name and a signature. She stared at the page, the wind tugging at her hair, the sky swelling with light. What does it mean? She asked. Elias looked up at her. It means you're free. She swallowed, her throat tight. But then, slowly, she smiled. Not for the land. Not for the inheritance. But for the truth in those words. She was free. The story hadn't ended yet. But something inside her finally had.